And good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Strictly History. I'm Katie.
I'm Allison.
And today we're going to be talking about the greatest spear run ever. It's a current movie. It just came out at the end of September. It's an Apple Plus movie with Zac Efron and Russell Crowe and Bill Murray. And we'll also talk about the Vietnam War, since the movie is centered around this guy who goes to Vietnam to give beers to guys from the neighborhood of Inwood, Manhattan, that are fighting off in Vietnam.
Yeah. It's crazy because it doesn't sound like a true story, but it is.
Yeah.
Like when I first watched the trailer, I was like, I feel like I would have heard about this before right now.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's like almost like a stupid bit, but then it's this guy, John Donahue, who's also called Chicky, because his middle name is Charles, so that's why they call him Chicky. I figured that one out this morning. And you know, he was upset about how people were doing anti-war protests at this point. The war is starting to become unpopular. So we're looking at probably the late 60s at this point.
I believe it was like the end of 1967 to the beginning of 1968 is when he actually goes.
Yeah.
So it is a time where protests are beginning to gain more energy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, he basically says, like, in interviews, too, you know, those were his friends over there fighting and dying and seeing anti-war protests, you know.
Yeah.
He wanted them to know that people back home still supported them when they probably weren't seeing that very actively.
Yeah. If they, wherever they were in Vietnam, were able to see anything that was going on back home, because a few of his friends, or at least one of his friends, was up in what was it, LZ Jane, and that was near the demilitarized zone, the line between North Vietnam and South Vietnam, and there's no way that he could have known what the sentiments were back home, like, at all. And I think it really shows when Chicky first sees his friend up in the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, the reaction that Chicky gets from his friend is very much like, what the hell are you doing here? Yeah. Why are you here? You don't need to be here, but you're here. And I mean, I think at first it's shock and then a little bit of anger, I think. And then it's like, oh, well, you know, he's just here.
Yeah.
And he becomes his responsibility.
Which is a big responsibility.
Yeah. Especially since they were up in, like, the ambush. Like, they were in charge of, like, this ambush zone that saw a lot of fighting. Yeah.
Which in interviews, that's around when Chicky says he realizes, you know, what a danger he's in, and it's like, should I have done this? This might not have been a good idea.
Yeah.
You know, because something I don't think they say in the movie that he's been to Vietnam before.
Yeah, he was, so it's like in the movie I don't excuse me, I don't remember if in the movie he had said that he was a merchant marine.
I don't think they did, but like, I could have missed it, but I don't think they did.
Right. So Chicky was a U.S. Marine. He was a U.S. Marine Corps, in the U.S. Marine Corps, but he never saw action.
Yeah.
And then he becomes a merchant marine, and he was over at Vietnam twice before. So and like the way he's depicted in the movie, it almost seems like he's never been to Vietnam.
Yeah, which I guess makes for a more interesting story, even though he'd never obviously been in combat.
Right.
It's not like he'd never been there. So
Right.
it doesn't seem as hard to believe that he
Mm-hmm.
would volunteer to
Right.
go when he has been there before. It's
Right.
not as crazy.
Right, right. And I mean, the movie almost depicts Chicky as being like this bum who
Yeah.
like talks the talk but doesn't really walk the walk, kind of an attitude, until and when he says, like, he'll go to Vietnam to give his friends beer and well wishes, and like just to show that people back home still, at least back home, still care about what they're doing and appreciate what they're doing. But he wasn't serious about it. And it wasn't until like the mothers and the like family members started like giving him stuff to give to his friends over at Vietnam that it kind of started becoming a real thing and a big deal.
Yeah.
And he's kind of almost like pushed into doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like the way they portrayed in the movie, it seems more like it's his idea to go.
Mm-hmm.
And like reading more about, what actually happened, it seems like the colonel, the bartender, had this idea, saying like, oh, if you give me like your papers, like your merchant marine papers, I'm gonna go to Vietnam.
Yeah.
And then thinking about it, he was like, oh, well, that's something I could do. I could just go to Vietnam.
Yeah.
So it was more like the idea was there, and then he was like, well, that's something I could accomplish, not just someone saying, I want to go bring them beer, and saying, well, I could go bring them beer.
Yeah.
It sounds sounds the same when I'm saying it out loud, but in my head it seemed a bit different. Like it was just a bit different.
Yeah. No, it makes sense though too, because it's like in the movie it almost seems like an offhanded thing, but like in real life, the colonel who was in the Marine Corps, and he was a bartender, and he tended this bar that I think he owned in Inwood, and it sounded almost like the impression that I got from interviews that I saw of the real life Chicky Donahue was that the colonel wanted to go.
Yeah.
But like because Chicky had been to Vietnam twice before, he said, "No, I'll go and see if I can try and find the guys." And he said try, not that he didn't think that it was going to be a successful venture to begin with.
Yeah, because everything I've seen said that he thought it would be impossible, that he wouldn't be able to find them, because you're going into a country, that's a war zone, and you're expecting to find 6 people.
Right.
But said it later turned into 4 people.
Yeah.
But, it's a handful of people in a country where you don't know if they're going to be where you thought they were going to be. Right. Or if it's even going to be possible for you to get to where they are.
Right. Especially LZ Jane, which they never were in the same place for more than 3 days.
Yeah.
And so the story itself is really remarkable and really heartfelt and heartwarming, but it's at the same time set during a very real, very dangerous, I don't want to say time period, but conflict in a country where we really, I'm going to be a little controversial, but I think it's safe to say that we really shouldn't have been in Vietnam. There was no reason for us to be there at all. And what I really appreciated about this film was that it didn't focus solely on military, like other movies beforehand, like Platoon and Forrest Gump and, all of those.
Yeah. Yeah, when I first...
was it Apocalypse Now,
Yeah. When I first watched the trailer, in the beginning of the trailer, it really gives you the impression, at least I got, that it was just going to be very pro-war, pro-Vietnam.
Right.
But even just watching the rest of the trailer, and then especially watching the whole movie, it's not like that at all.
Right.
And because the beginning of the movie portrays it as a very just like silly, like, oh, he's going to Vietnam. It doesn't seem like a big deal, especially when he sees his first friend, Collins, you know.
Yeah.
They're not in a war zone. Nothing's really happening.
Right.
And obviously the main characters up until that point are very pro-war, and they don't really understand, you know, the reality of the situation.
Absolutely.
And they're in opposition to the protesters. So it seems like they might not be that critical of the war in the beginning of the movie, but obviously once they get into it,
it's
apparent they are.
Yeah, and I feel like, so like when we watch him go from his port start point and go all the way up to LZ Jane to find his other friend, you know, it's like that generic like war movie kind of a thing where you're solely focused on the military aspect of the war. But what I appreciated about it was that before he gets to LZ Jane, he's at a bar in did he start in Saigon? Because I know in real life he started in a different city.
I feel like in the movie I think he does start in Saigon, because then he goes back to Saigon.
Right.
But yeah, in reality, he didn't start in Saigon.
Right, he ended his journey in Saigon. But he's at this bar that's frequented by military and journalists. And there's a shot of names behind the bar, and it's people it's like their names and then the journalists that they were reporting for, like newspapers and stuff like that. And it's journalists who died reporting on this conflict, and it's an aspect of the war that I've never seen before.
Yeah.
And, you know, you have Chicky talking to some of the reporters and the corresponders, and it's getting their point of view from this one guy's point of view of, like, you know, you're reporting on all the wrong things. It's like, why wouldn't you report on the good things that's going on? But it's like, and like having the hindsight of 2020, you know, as a viewer, and if you know anything about the Vietnam War, there was nothing good about it. Nothing. Yeah, we weren't liberal to the Vietnamese that were especially living in the countryside. We were not liberators. And what I liked seeing was, like, when Chicky left an airbase after coming back from LZ Jane, he's walking down this dirt road in the middle of the jungle, essentially, and he comes across this little girl, and you don't hear any conversation at all, but it's only music, but you can kind of tell what he's saying. And he goes to pick up the ball that she dropped, and she immediately starts crying, like sobbing. And he goes, you know, it's okay, I'm an American. Like, that would make things better, but it just makes her sob even more. And then you have her mother run out of the field, pick her up, and run into it. And it just hammers home how the South Vietnamese felt about the Americans in the countryside of Vietnam.
Yeah.
Of South Vietnam, it should specify.
And the way he's coming in with the perspective that not only is the U.S. government trying to pass on to the public, but also the perspectives coming from, like, World War II, where there was a more clear-cut, you know,
who the enemy was,
what the goal was.
Yeah.
But, like, showing parts like that, you know, he understands, and we also understand that the Americans aren't seen as liberators, you know, fighting for freedom.
Right.
And that, you know, this little girl and many other Vietnamese would be scared when they see a U.S. soldier. Right. Because they know what's happening in their own country and the destruction.
And like
that comes with that presence.
Yeah, and they know about, like, even if it wasn't their own village that was napalmed, they most certainly know about the American fighter jets that flew over and dropped napalm on other villages. Shouldn't really say villagers, but it was other villages The villagers just happened to be there. It
just happened.
It just happened. And I mean, I think one of the classic pictures from the war is all of these village children running away from their village that was just napalmed, and seeing the little girl, her clothes are gone because they've been burned off by napalm. She's burned all over, and it's just a really stark contrast of what we as how it's a stark contrast from other wars that we have been a part of.
Yeah, I did appreciate too the way that the Vietnamese were presence in the movie. And
absolutely.
They showed that impact that the war would have on the people who actually live here and have to deal with those things. Like after Saigon's attacked, you get that when he's walking through the city, and later I think he's in a car or something.
It's with I know the scene you're talking about. So it's after the Tet Offensive in Saigon, and it's the next morning, it's after the conflict happened, and he gets into a car with Russell Crowe's character, whose name is Arthur, who was a war photographer in Vietnam during the conflict. And because an ammo depot has been hit, and Chicky has a friend who's over in the ammo depot, and he wants to see and make sure that he's alive, essentially. And so they're driving through the city, and it's a slow motion shot, and Chicky's looking off at the city as they're driving by, and he sees a line of Vietnamese people, and they're dead. They've been killed, and you see families grieving, and it's just like the juxtaposition, the parallel of seeing that and seeing how families grieve in at home. It just shows that the Vietnamese were not static participants of what was going on. They were they had autonomy of what was going on, and they were also attacked.
Like it shows the impact that the war is having on them as well. They're actually experiencing the conflict in their own backyards. So I think that's important to show, and important for Chicky to see. Because it's not just combatants, being injured, dying. It's just people living in their own city. So I think that's an important thing that I think they did well.
And I also like how they also added in the government agents, like the CIA implement into it, or like the military blowing the hole, the tank blowing, the U.S. tank blowing the hole in the wall of the U.S. embassy, and the military saying that the Viet Cong, which were the northern Vietnamese fighters, had blown a hole in the wall, and that's how they got in, which that wasn't the case at all.
And when he talks to Arthur about it, he says, like, I think it was Arthur.
It was the group of the reporters that
so it
were
wasn't
there,
Arthur,
but Arthur was part of that group.
Because there's an ongoing discussion about how important the truth is to report, based on or just negative things. Like we spoke a little about before, when he first meets the reporters, he's like, well, you guys only report the bad things. And he doesn't think it's that realistic, because how could the government be lying to you?
Right.
But he realizes as he's there, what's being reported by the government is not what's actually happening.
Right.
Like the government wants you to believe that the conflict is going well, that it'll end soon. The United States is winning. There's no way they could lose.
Right.
the casualties aren't that bad. But
yeah. And I really liked, because he does say that. He's like, why would the government, lie about it? And then he's in this helicopter with an actual CIA agent and a Vietnamese interpreter who's helping, and they have a prisoner, and they're trying to get him to say where there are more Viet Cong like operatives and stuff like that, and he tells them or like tells them something, and then the CIA agent like pushes the guy out of the helicopter.
Yeah.
And I think for Chicky, seeing that, it's like a wake-up call almost. It's like, that no, this really happened, and of course our government is going to lie to the American people to say one thing when something else is going on.
And to get visible evidence of the United States not acting as, kind liberators.
Right.
There are atrocities going on.
Yeah.
And that's really thrown in his face to see something like that.
And it what I like about the movie as well, with in regards to Chicky, the main character, we have him start as being, pro-war and patriotic and all this other stuff, and his character grows throughout the entire movie to when he gets back, and he understands now what's actually going on, and has that perspective like that our soldiers had and our reporters had, and it's like, and he grows as a character and as a human being.
I liked the end of the movie where he has that conversation at the bar with the friends that he'd started with the bartender who started this whole thing,
right?
Saying war is chaotic, but this is different. It's not, what previous wars have been like. Previous wars that veterans there would have had experience with. It's not the same situation. And that's just not the reality.
And it almost seemed like his friends that he saw at the bar after coming back still didn't get it. Which would make sense because they didn't see it firsthand. They didn't see what was going on, what our military was doing, or what our military was saying in contradiction to what was actually going on. And what I thought was really, really sad, like I like almost started crying when I saw the scene, was Chicky like befriends a Vietnamese police, like he's almost like a traffic cop. Like he's directing traffic and all this other stuff, and he wants to go to Oklahoma because of the movie Oklahoma, and like when the cop takes Chicky to the U.S. Embassy, it's they exchange names, and he gives the character his address in New York and his phone number, and then the tent offensive happens, the fighting and stuff, and they get to the U.S. Embassy, and he's dead in the street. And I think that also hits home to Chicky of like how bad things are, and how like you can lose a friend or a family member within a blink of an eye, regardless of how safe you think or you are, or how you feel you are. It was like it really like it hit me really hard, because he wasn't a Viet Cong. He was just a guy just doing his job, wanting to visit the United States, and he was a victim of violence.
There's a part too where he sees, I think it was like a car blew up, and he sees the soldiers that were
gonna go
in that
into
explosion,
it.
And one of them's lost an arm. So like he sees a lot of the reality of what's going on. So yeah, when he comes back, he's not, an unquestioning supporter of the war effort.
Yeah.
But he still supports, the soldiers themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But the war effort by the government is something he, isn't just going to believe in without questioning what's going on anymore.
And I love the conversation he has with his sister, who has always been part of like that anti-war protest, and they just like sit on the park bench and he gives her the last can of beer. Excuse me. And it's just the conversation that they have is just really, it's really good.
Yeah.
I don't remember what the conversation was, but
it also, like, their relationship too shows that, like, they always should have been on the same side.
Yeah.
Because even he shows up to the protests in the beginning of the movie, and he goes to put out the candles, and she's like, "What are you doing? Like, these are for the soldiers who died."
Yeah.
And he's like, "Oh, I thought they were for peace."
Yeah.
So he supports, lighting candles for the soldiers who died, but he doesn't support ending the war because he would think, one, that the United States is fighting for a just cause, and two, that would be, you want to keep fighting for the people who have already sacrificed their lives. Mm-hmm. But they're on the same side. They all support the soldiers.
Yeah.
And I think by the end, that's really come together.
Yeah. Yeah.
You support the soldiers by supporting the war effort being over.
Right. Exactly. And I feel like that in the beginning of the movie that he didn't understand that, some people in the anti-war protests are really like extreme and the signs are really extreme and all this other stuff, but there are others in the anti-war protests that want to end the war to bring the soldiers home or to prevent kids, essentially, because you're looking at 18-year-olds going to fight a war that no one really knows why they're fighting to begin with, except to stop the commies from coming down, which is unsuccessful. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting too. They introduced like some things, and they don't go like super into it, but like he's talking to one of the other soldiers up near the DMZ, and he's saying that he was sent home. He finished his tour, but he's come back because when he went back to the United States, it just didn't seem like the place he had left.
Yeah, he said that he didn't fit in.
Yeah, and for a lot of soldiers, coming home was a very isolating experience.
Because,
one day you're in this war zone where you could die at any moment, and then the next day you're home, and it's...
And no one gets what you went through.
And no one gets it. And there was some hostility, people who did criticize the soldiers, because there were some soldiers
that were
doing terrible things.
There's a good scene between Arthur and Chicky, and Chicky's come back to Saigon after finding out that his ship left without him and all this other stuff. And they're at the bar, but they move over to a table outside, and it's the Vietnamese New Year, and there's supposed to be a ceasefire during New Year and all this other stuff, and they're talking about reporting on the truth. But before that, I believe it was this scene. Arthur tells him the story about how some of our soldiers had gone into a village, and one of the soldiers got really trigger happy and killed women, children, husbands, and none of them had really like any evidence that they were working with the Viet Cong.
Yeah. And that is a thing that was happening at times, and people would apply those atrocities to the soldiers as a whole. So then, people come home and people look at them as baby killers or...
Yeah, and I mean, I don't remember what the incident was called, but there was an incident during the Vietnam War where a group of soldiers had gone into a village.
The Malay Massacre.
Want to say that a little louder?
The Malay Massacre.
Thank you.
I think that's how you say it.
Yeah,
but I could be wrong.
And the entire village was wiped out.
Yeah.
For no real reason. Like, they thought that there was that they were helping the Viet Cong, but there was no evidence to suggest that they were.
Yeah, I do believe that happened in 1969, so that would be after the events of this movie, but I'm sure similar things were happening throughout. This is just the most prominent one.
Right. Yeah, I would agree that there may have been other incidents of that, of one or maybe a few soldiers going trigger happy and attacking villagers without any real evidence to suggest that they were helping the...
Or it may have been it happened in 1968, but people were learning that it happened in 1969.
Yeah,
which is also, you know, these things could be happening, but if no one's talking about it, then the American public wouldn't know that they're happening.
Right.
But once they're learning about these things, you know, if you're already questioning why the United States is at war, if you're losing people that you love fighting in the war, and then you see this sort of stuff happening, how could you just support?
Right. Excuse me. And, you know, so, like, I didn't realize that. So I did a little research on, like, figures of people who died fighting in the Vietnam War, and I didn't realize that the Vietnam War lasted from 1954 to 1972.
Yeah.
So it's a long time of, like, almost 20 years worth of fighting. But I found out that 60 journalists died, 58,220 American soldiers died. Now, if I'm reading the number correctly, it's 1,100,000 Northern Vietnamese soldiers died. That's atrocious. That it's that high. And then it was like 200,000. It was between 200,000 and 250,000 Southern Vietnamese soldiers had died during this conflict. And the numbers are, you know, outrageous. And I got my sources from Britannica Encyclopedia, and it was and the numbers were estimated from like 1995. Whether or not it's more or less, I don't think anyone has really looked into it since that estimation had been made. But I was shocked at how high the North Vietnamese soldiers were, their fatalities.
And there were a lot of lasting effects of our war there too. Agent Orange still, there's a lot of lasting effects from that, even on children born today. And there are so many mines just lost in the Vietnamese countryside. And like, you know, if you're walking around, you might step on a mine. Like it's awful.
It almost like this. I don't know how good of opinion this. It almost parallels what happened in Afghanistan, and
it does.
Yeah. Like just seeing the evacuation of Saigon with a helicopter on top of an apartment building. I thought it was the U.S. Embassy, but it was actually an apartment building that the CIA agents were using. Just seeing how many Vietnamese were trying to escape the North Vietnamese that were coming into Saigon, it absolutely parallels the Afghanis trying to flee Afghan as we were leaving because the Taliban were coming back.
Yeah, I think they're very similar conflicts in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. Like there are a lot of parallels you could draw.
Yeah, almost 20 years of fighting. And I mean, the parallels are far too similar, I feel, to ignore completely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it is very interesting, especially like in regards to Vietnam, because it was a long, you know, because there is like a 20-year span, but there was a lot of escalation before we get to the point where people would consider, when they think of the war in Vietnam, usually they're thinking of like 1964 until 1973.
Yeah, because
after Congress authorized military intervention.
Right. Yeah, because 1954 you still have JFK in as our president, and I know
well, JFK was elected in 1960.
Okay,
I think
wrong.
Eisenhower was president.
Eisenhower. So I mean, but you had, needless to say, whoever was our president at the time, we had intervened with the Vietnamese government already at this point, because we were we supported the democratic government of the time, but the president and his wife were corrupt, and Vietnam has a very large Buddhist population, and I don't know how large of the population still is now, but back in the 50s and 60s it was a very large population, and I think the Christianity population was like the minority to the Buddhist population, and there was a lot of atrocities against the Buddhist population in Vietnam during that time. And I feel I remember seeing, during one of my classes, I can't remember if it was high school or if it was college, and a Buddhist monk had protested what was going on by lighting himself on fire and just sitting there and not doing anything, just allowing himself to die, to essentially burn himself alive. And the Vietnamese president at the time, his wife had said, and I don't know if she was reported to have been said that or was alleged to have said it, but she said something to the effect of, it was Buddhist barbecue or something really offensive to to that incident, and it was not looked on favorably at all, which only made the conflict in Vietnam even worse. And the Vietnamese wanted the government to change, wanted the democratic government out of Vietnam, and I think that was also a catalyst for Ho Chi Minh to come in and be like, well, this is better. We can we won't have this anymore.
We rigged the elections that got the President Ngo Dinh Diem in office anyway, and Ho Chi Minh was already sort of a beloved figure in Vietnam. I had a professor explain it to me, he was sort of like how we look at George Washington.
Yeah.
Like the general who got us independence. And so, if Ho Chi Minh would have won that election, but we tampered with it.
Right. And what I find interesting about Ho Chi Minh as well is that he was educated in this country and in Europe, and during during the conflicts in Vietnam, the fighting in Vietnam, however you want to say it, he actually used tactics that was used by George Washington during the American Revolution. So he used our own tactics against us.
Yeah. I mean, I think also it's difficult because of how different Vietnam was to things like World War II.
Yeah.
The strategies that you used were just not going to be something you could do.
No.
Which is why it's more similar to something like fighting in the Middle East, because there's insurgents. You should be fighting a counterinsurgency.
Guerrilla warfare was really big during the Vietnam Wars. More so with the Viet Cong, because they were fighting mostly in the jungle.
Yeah. And also that you're not fighting an enemy that is as visible as it would have been in World War II. You go into villages the people there don't support you because you are destroying their country.
Right.
And you don't know who is going to fight and who are just civilians that they
are
might be hostile, but they're not gonna fight.
Right. Or there's just civilians that are caught in the crossfire because they just happened to be there near a village that could possibly be helping the Viet Cong, and it's a show. Excuse my language.
And if there's no preparation to fight a war like that, then it's not going to go well.
No.
And the United States government did not seem prepared to fight a war like that.
No. And to constantly say that we are winning, that things are going well, it's so there's so much information that comes from Vietnam that I'm surprised that no one kind of drew that parallel to the misinformation that was going on now about elections and all that other stuff, but that's a whole other discussion we can get into later. But it's like the same.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the government has to lie.
Yeah.
You know, because who's going to support a war that the government's not winning and doesn't seem winnable? Right. They're not going to support it.
No.
You know, and you have to portray it as a fight, you know, to protect American freedom.
Yeah.
To protect the country, even if it's not like that.
Yeah. And I think another good movie, if you, our viewers, watch this movie and want to see more, the Post with Tom Hanks and Meryl Streep, it's all about the Pentagon Papers, which have to do with Vietnam and the war that was going on there. And there's a character, there's the Henry Kissinger character that's portrayed in this movie in the Post. And it's such a well done movie, and it shows how, like, Richard Nixon wanted to censor the New York Times because they had published some of them, but the Post, you know, and like how the Post had won the Supreme Court ruling that they couldn't be censored because of freedom of the press and freedom of speech. And so, I mean, it's a really good I think another good, like, perspective to look at if you want to see a film that also ties in the Vietnam War.
Yeah, I was just reading that when the Pentagon Papers came out, Nixon didn't care too much initially because it didn't really have much to do with his administration. Although this could be wrong. Right. But because it was exposing government secrets, I think Kissinger recommended that he do something because it could be bad later on. You know, even though it's not really hurting him now.
Right.
The precedent that it would set wouldn't look good.
No. So I think that also carried on the anti-war protests and wanting to leave Vietnam and all that other stuff. And yeah.
I mean, Vietnam is something that had a major impact on the government's credibility.
Oh, absolutely.
And a time before that, people didn't really think that the government wasn't being honest with them. Like, that's something, you know, like, now we don't necessarily think the government's telling us the truth, but before that they would have trusted the government was being honest with them.
Absolutely.
And, you know, once things are coming out that, you know, the war isn't being fought for the reasons that you were told, you know, that would really shake your faith in
absolutely
a lot of things.
Absolutely. So, do we want to say anything more about this, or are we?
I think overall it was pretty realistic.
Yeah.
I would like to read the book to see how, you know, like, based on interviews that Chicky gave recently, it seems like it was pretty realistic. Yeah. But obviously there were certain liberties. Like Arthur wasn't a real photographer during the war. He was a fictional character made up to portray ideas that he learned from various people while he was in Vietnam. Which, that's what you do in movies.
Right.
You take all the things that other people told him, put it in one person, so he can learn it in one person.
I didn't watch the movie, but when I read up on it a little bit, I did see that Chicky's apparently known for telling some tall tales. So it, you know, there might be a little bit of exaggeration in his accounts, but.
Yeah, I downloaded the Greatest Spear Run Ever, which is his memoir, or partial memoir, And so I'm going to listen to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It seems like it'd be a good book. I've heard good things about it.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
And to get a little more detail on things that were interesting. I do think it was interesting the way he said he didn't know if anyone assumed he was a CIA agent, but they definitely assumed he was with the federal government somehow.
Yeah.
Or if he told them more about what he did, that they didn't know what a merchant marine was, so they would kind of just be like, okay, sure.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, let's go.
Yeah. Or like, he'd give a sob story about trying to find his stepbrother because a family member had passed away and he wanted to hear it. He wanted to tell it to him himself and not hear about it through a letter or a phone call. So, yeah, it could have been any one of those things.
Yeah, so like that's something I'd like to know a little bit more about.
Yeah.
That seemed very interesting in the movie.
Yeah, and like from another recently made movie about Marilyn Monroe that's based off of a book that I think really just inflates rumors about her life. I feel like this, though, because the story is so outrageous that it can't possibly be exaggerated, like at least to me, in my opinion. But it's because it happened. It's based in some form of truth, whether or not Chicky exaggerated it or not. It's,
I mean, there's pictures of him there. It's been proven that he was there.
Yeah.
I think he went to talk to some journalist, and he brought the passport that he got at Saigon so that he could go back to the United States. So it definitely happened.
Yeah.
It's just how many of like the small details, if they were played up.
Right.
Because it was a story he told for a long time in a bar.
Right.
So, as when you tell stories, some things might be exaggerated a bit.
Right, absolutely. But not all of it is based off of rumor, but fact. So it should be an interesting read or listen. So, yeah. And we highly recommend you, our viewers, watch the movie, read the book, listen to the book. It should be a good time.
Yes, and watch the movie.
Yeah.
I believe it's still in theaters because it only came out like a week ago.
Yeah, the end of September. It's in the September 30th it came out, I think.
Yeah, so if anyone's interested, it's out there. And you could see it.
Yeah. And Zac Efron's great as Chicky.
Yes. Yeah, I really enjoyed the performances. I think he gave the right amount of like fun, but also when it was serious, it was serious.
I feel like Zac Efron really portrayed Chicky's like naivety going into Vietnam, like, not really, like knowing you're going into a war zone, but not thinking it's going to be as bad as people think it's going to be, but then seeing that it's worse.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So, go ahead, go and watch that. Go and watch The Greatest Beer Run Ever. Like, comment, subscribe. Let us know what you think of the movie or the book in our comments, if you feel so inclined. And we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.